it's 11 here, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. Can everyone online hear us? Okay, seeing some nods, thanks. I'm joined by my colleague in Utah, so she's going to get us started. Pass it to you, Shelley.
Okay. My name's Shelley Doljak. I'm a software engineer at Stanford University Libraries on the library systems team. My colleague, Alyssa Hafley, is our library systems analyst, and we are presenting on automating folio workflows with Apache Airflow. We're going to talk about these four workflows we automated using Airflow: the vendor management app, the payment feed to Oracle Financials, data exports, and digital bookplates. We will briefly talk about what we used to do for each, and we will talk about how staff interface with what we automated in Airflow. To provide some context, prior to Folio, we were on Cersei Dynix Symphony ILS for 25 plus years. In that time, we automated a lot of staff workflows using Oracle database jobs written in PL/SQL and Perl and Corn Shell scripts running on our Unix server that hosted Symphony. We are a self-hosting shop, so naturally we decided to self-host Folio. For our migration to Folio, we used Apache Airflow to migrate our bibliographic and holdings data. Why Apache Airflow? Since we already had some departmental experience with Airflow, using it for automating Folio workflows seemed to make sense. It also provided the opportunity for more of us on library systems to learn Python. There's a large open source community that uses it for data engineering. Airflow uses a workflows as code approach. It provides dynamic workflow generation and parameterization, scheduling, tracking and rerunning failed tasks in a workflow, and extending functionality with built-in operators and plugins. For example, we import EBSCO's Folio client in order to interact with Folio APIs within the automated workflows. And lastly, we learned about Docker and containerization. We deploy Airflow and Docker containers to our servers.
So I'm going to talk about our vendor management application. As we were preparing to migrate to Folio, we had to prioritize which of our many previous Symphony integrations would happen for day one. And it was decided by our steering committee that loading vendor data, specifically bibliographic data, was required as soon as we migrated. So this became the first application that we worked on, and we chose to do that in Airflow. You can go to the next slide, Shelley. So what we had before in Symphony, we had a locally developed application we called the eLoader that was used to process and load thousands of MARC records a year. It was a Perl script that was triggered through a scheduled job from our Oracle database server, and it could also call other custom Perl scripts to pre-process our MARC records. Our cataloging policy at the time called for a single record approach for electronic and print records. So this script would look for matches based on record ID, ISBN, and then verify that match through title matching and add URLs to our print records. And then we also had a staff UI that was Ruby on Rails where they could manage their e-resource packages. And then completely separate from that, we had a number of other scripts that loaded our order records and our EDI invoices. So going to Folio, we knew we wanted to try and leverage Folio functionality. We wanted to try and streamline our workflows. And it was an opportunity for us to look at all of these things together and maybe change some policies that were no longer serving us. Next slide. So how do we approach it? Like we mentioned, it was day one requirement. We were only a few months out from our migration, and it was a pretty complex set of workflows involving a lot of staff. So we borrowed a development team from our digital repository side of the house, and we were able to schedule a full work cycle just to concentrate on this particular integration. Our team, the library systems team that would normally do this kind of work, was busy with the migration, so we relied on our colleagues to come in and kind of bail us out. We also brought in stakeholders from our various tech services areas. We knew we wanted to try and leverage data import. We knew we wanted to try and bring a couple workflows together into one app, and we also knew that we wanted to try and empower staff to have more control over these processes. We did encounter quite a few challenges along the way. The timeline was super tight. Trying to reimagine workflows and address policy change at the same time we were doing development was quite challenging. That single record approach that I mentioned earlier, which had already been under question by our metadata staff, we had to really look at that to see if we could put the effort forth to recreate it or leave that policy behind. And then we just had to balance the ideal versus reality. So we ideally wanted to put our URLs into our holdings records, but the functionality wasn't there quite yet, and we had all of our legacy data to contend with, so we had to make compromises along the way. In the end, we knew we needed to be able to retrieve and load records, make minor MARC modifications, split the files into smaller sizes because that was not built into data import yet, and we had this tight timeline and a set flower release of Nolana. So I took this from the work cycle documentation. Our goal for this was a data loading management UI for staff and a data processing pipeline that replaces much of the current automation while working with Folio's current data import functionality and remaining flexible enough to take advantage of future improvements. So simply put, we just needed an app that would fetch files from fetch files of data from our vendors on a schedule and then send them on to data import. Next slide. So we turned to Airflow and Airflow's core concept of DAGs. So we'll say that word a lot in this presentation. It stands for directed acyclic graph. And from the Airflow docs, it means a DAG is a model that encapsulates everything needed to execute a workflow. Next slide. This is a look at the overall technical solution we ended up with for this application that we call VMA. It's a Flask app in Airflow that is our staff interface, and that talks to Folio and a database that contains vendor configuration details and state information about the files we are processing. And then each of those, you can see my mouse here, each of these are separate DAGs that either do the processing that we need or kick off other DAGs. Next slide. This is a look at the UI. So this is what the staff interfaces with. You can see there's a list of vendors and there's a search box here. And then there's also a dashboard that staff can go into and see the status of their files. If they have errored, they can retry the loading right from this interface. Next slide. This is that bigger box there is a detailed look of what the staff sees when they go into a vendor. Sorry, it's kind of tiny, but it contains location details, scheduling information, the data import profile that the staff would like to use, and then some minor MARC modification options. And then in the smaller box is a look at Folio's organization records. And I just wanted to call out that we power our vendor management app using Folio organization records, specifically leveraging the interface portion of the organization record. So we, in each interface, we store connection information. And then in our app, the user can have separate configurations for each of the interfaces. So that means they can have a separate configuration for bibliographic MARC files, order MARC files, EDI invoices. Moving on to the next slide. And then finally, we had some reporting requirements we had to deal with. So Airflow will email reports of the files fetched and loaded with brief summary load reports embedded in the email. And then we point the user back to Folio. So we weren't trying to recreate any of the data import reporting. We had hoped that we might be able to improve it or enhance it by reporting back data import errors and then maybe auto retrying them, but that proved too complicated for the time we had, and we had to leave it at what it is now. So our staff in the meantime use MetaDB and Tableau to supplement where some of this reporting is lacking. And I think that's it for VMA. I'm going to pass it to Shelley for Oracle Financials.
Okay, so Oracle Financials. This is the payment fee to university accounts payable. It was also a day one priority, but as with all things Folio, things just take longer than what you estimate. We implemented it shortly after we migrated in August of 2023. Our previous integration was, again, an Oracle database job written in PLSQL to generate a feeder file that was processed into Oracle Financials. So I look for opportunities to change things, specifically generating the feeder file, which is a fixed width file format where each piece of data occupies a predetermined number of characters, kind of like a MARC record. Ugh, fixed width file formats. Do we have to keep creating this file format? Is there not an API out there that we can use to post payments data? Alas, there was no API available with our version of Oracle Financials at the university. So this is an example of a feeder file we have to generate. It's gross. A former developer in library systems wrote the PLSQL code that generated the feeder file. So instead of racking our brains reading that code to try to figure it out, we enlisted the help of our acquisitions librarian on what data goes in what field and figuring out where that data is in Folio. She created this spreadsheet that details what each field in the feeder file meant and what data from Folio should map to it. It also includes some business logic for particular fields, such as this field in the top right corner, will call. If will call is in terms, meaning staff input will call in the terms field of the Folio invoice, then insert Y in the feeder file, and if blank, then blank. In terms of getting specifications from stakeholders, this spreadsheet was awesome. Prior to migrating to Folio, we were able to split fund distributions on either amount or percentage. We had to make a policy change that acquisitions would only do percentage splits because of the way Folio stored the data for the tax adjustments on an invoice. This is better explained through an illustrative example. So here we have both invoices on the left and the right side are the same with multiple fund distributions. The left is split on percentage while the right is split on amount. Can you see my cursor here, maybe?
Yep, you
Okay.
can see it.
Folio gives us the adjustments total of $4.56, but we need to put in our feeder file the actual amount of tax paid or tax accrued for each fund distribution. With amount split, we'd have to reverse engineer whatever Folio did to apply whatever tax amount plus subtotal for Fund A that made it sum up to $10.91. With percentage split, all we need to do is apply the split percentage to the adjustments total to figure the tax paid or tax accrued for a fund. And we can also apply the split percentage to the subtotal down here at $50 to figure out the amount distributed from each fund before taxes. Luckily, our acquisition folks agreed with us that this was messy and it would be much easier to just do percentage splits. So implementing all this in Airflow, we ended up with 3 DAGs. A DAG to send payments, a DAG to get reports from accounts payable and manage those files on the Airflow server, and a DAG to process the reports and update Folio invoices and voucher statuses. A graphical view of the payments to Orphan DAG is on the right. On the left, I've outlined each step of the DAG. To summarize, We query Folio for invoices. We transform that data to a payments model. We remove invoices that should be excluded from the feeder file, which then get reported. We generate the feeder file, SFTP it to accounts payable server, update vouchers in Folio to pending, and email a report of what we did. This next DAG, the AP payment report DAG, is actually a new workflow that we didn't do prior to Folio. Previously, when we sent invoices to accounts payable, we'd mark them as paid in the ILS. In Folio, when we send them, we mark them as pending. This new workflow essentially confirms that what we sent got paid by AP. This DAG processes rows of a CSV file that we get back from accounts payable. We update invoices to paid, and in the voucher, we update the disbursement amount, disbursement number, and disbursement date. Lastly, we email a report of what happened and if there were any errors. We have a UI so that users can download files for funsies. Actually, so that staff can verify and troubleshoot any issues with data we sent in the feeder file, or see the report that we got back from accounts payable. Airflow plugins like this UI allows us to empower our users to help themselves. Previously, the feeder files were inaccessible on our server. Our payments DAG and reports DAG send email reports of what they did and if there were errors, like I said before. On the top left is a screenshot from an email of approved invoices sent to AP. There are emails for when invoices or invoice lines meet a particular error criteria and should be excluded from the feeder file. These exclusions are the fiscal year is not the current one, the invoice date is in the future, the vendor code in Folio isn't correct for a vendor that's supposed to be paid with the feeder file, and an invoice line has a zero subtotal, and the invoice number is too long since it messes with the fixed width file format. For the paid invoices report we get from AP, we send email reports and of invoices marked as paid, as shown on the right. And these are all with hyperlinks to the actual invoice in Folio or the invoice line in Folio. For the paid invoice, and when there are errors in the DAG here at the bottom, we see email reports for already paid invoices and sometimes invoices that are missing from Folio. How did that happen? Data exports.
All right, we're going to go back over to the bibliographic realm with data exports. Close this real quick. So data exports was not a day one integration for us. It was a year one integration. So we could kind of wait for the dust to settle on our migration and then start up with this effort. You can go to the next slide, Shelley. What we had before was regular exports to a number of vendors and organizations of bibliographic data mostly. Examples like OCLC, POD, our authority vendor. We also had to do regular full dumps of our catalog, and we needed to provide staff with export reports. Similarly to data imports, we had some opportunities to look at our workflows and Folio functionality and the vendors themselves that we were working with. One of our examples is OCLC. They had been encouraging us to move to their metadata API service and leverage that newer technology. So this was a chance for us to pretty drastically change our workflow, but we wanted to explore that. Next slide. So how did we approach this? We did not have a borrowed team of developers this time around. We didn't have a formal work cycle. We had to build this functionality alongside of keeping Folio up and running that first year. So it took a lot longer, but we made some progress. We followed a similar pattern of analysis, subject matter expert consultation. We turned to the community to find out what others were doing. And then we looked at what still needed to be done. So we didn't want to just recreate what we had done before. We really wanted to figure out, do we need to be exporting all this data? Does it need to be in separate feeds? And then we consulted with our tech services staff to find out what priority order they wanted to do this work in. Just like with the vendor management app, we wanted to empower our staff. These processes had all been run by library systems behind the scenes before, and we wanted to see how we could give them more ownership over these workflows. Some of the decisions we needed to make along the way, we needed to see if FOLIO had the functionality to do this for us. We looked at data export, we looked at OAI PMH. Ultimately, we decided that they weren't going to work for us. We were concerned about scaling. We couldn't really use the selection criteria that we needed to with either of those functionalities. But we did spend some time doing some analysis. We also had policy decisions to make. We're a number of separate libraries in one tenant, so we had to make sure that we were all on the same page about where our data was going and how we were going to select it out of the system. And then we had technical aspects to deal with, where to find the data and how to get it, how to know which records to send and not send. And we needed to be able to accommodate both full dumps and ongoing exports. So we really had to think about scale. That's just a few of the things we had to decide along the way, much more, of course. So we turned to Airflow again. You can go to the next slide, Shelley. And DAGs and DAGs and more DAGs. So this is a look at some of our export DAGs. We have Airflow as the framework with different DAGs for each vendor's selection and then the sending of the data. So you can see on the screen, they're coupled in a select and a send DAG. This allows us flexibility to accommodate differences for each place we send records, but build on what we've done before. It allows for future additions of new vendors, and it makes it easier to couple with our existing vendor management app framework. Next slide. This is a look at one of our selection DAGs, one of our more simple selection DAGs. So we query our database with SQL for instance IDs for new, updated, and deleted or suppressed records based on our specifications. We then fetch the MARC records from source storage using the APIs and an instance ID. I'll note here that for our full export, we don't rely on the APIs, but we grab the MARC from a materialized view of our database. And then there's a couple different tasks that transform the MARC depending on what we need to do for that vendor. We use a combination of SQL and API calls to add translated holdings and items info into our MARC tags, if that's required for a specific vendor. And then sometimes we use the PyMarc Python package to do further MARC data processing. Next slide. This is not meant to be understood or described by me, but this is just to show you that this is a different selection DAG for a more complex vendor. And you can see that it branches out in certain areas to do additional steps. Next slide. This is our send DAG. It's pretty simple. It gathers files. It transmits the data via HTTP, FTP, or API, and then it generates and emails some reports for us and our users. Next slide. So just like with our other applications that we've talked about so far, we also have a UI for staff to interface with. They can go here and download any of the files that we've sent to vendors, and they can get the file format that we've sent, and they can also access a CSV with record IDs. And this is really helpful for troubleshooting. And then separate from that, we have a UI for manual uploads. So a staff member, if they're working on a special project or something, they can go here, upload a CSV of OCLC IDs and send those along. And this UI just triggers the DAGs that we showed earlier. Next slide. And then finally, we have reporting. So most of our reporting for data exports is pretty simple. We just generate an email saying that it worked or didn't work. That's mostly used by library systems, but OCLC is an example of a pretty complex reporting requirement for our staff. So we created a separate UI just for OCLC where we generate and make available error reports based on what we get back from OCLC's APIs. And then staff can come here and use those to process the errors. I think that's it. I'll just say that we are in the middle of restarting our work with our authority vendor. We're loading authority records, and we're about to begin the ongoing processing for that. So that's going to be our first example of combining both the vendor management app and our data exports. So we'll export records to them with this application, and then we'll load the return records with our vendor management app. So that'll be cool. Shelley?
Yeah. All right. So digital book plates. Digital book plates was also a first year on Folio priority. The deadline for it was after the end of fiscal year rollover and before donor letters are sent. The donor letters include a link to our discovery layer showing book plated collections, as shown here on this slide. Our previous implementation of digital book plates was using Perl scripts on our server to look up in a database where we kept expenditures and add 979 tags to MARC records paid on those bookplate funds. We also had a Ruby script that got data about digital bookplates from our digital object repository so that we could keep track of new or changed bookplate information, like new images or a changed fund name. Lastly, we had a staff UI for loading bookplate data to gifts or funds that were not tracked in the expenditures table. So we had a 6-week work cycle to re-implement these things in Folio, with Folio. We looked at the donor model, thinking we could do one bookplate equals one donor, but that was a Kesnelia feature, and at the time we were on Poppy. Also, the work to link donors to inventory wasn't even implemented in Q yet anyways, so we scratched that idea off. The next thing we looked at was whether or not we could get away from putting 979 tags in MARC data, because I'm always advocating for getting away from MARC data. But too bad we couldn't do it because our discovery layer indexing, that team wasn't going to change anything for our work cycle. So here we are stuck again with MARC data. So this is how we did it. We have Airflow in the middle to get the digital bookplate information or data from the Stanford Digital Repository and load it into Folio. We have a Flask plugin in Airflow to allow staff to add 979 tags to records. So this diagram here breaks down a bit of exactly what is happening. Starting on the top left, we have a DAG to fetch bookplate metadata, which gets the members of the bookplate collection in the Stanford Digital Repository, looks up the descriptive metadata for each of those, extracts data we need to construct a 979 tag, and finally stores it in a database table we added to Airflow. When there is a new bookplate, when there is a new bookplate fund in that this DAG finds, it passes that data as a configuration to another DAG, this one here at the bottom, which finds all instances paid on the bookplate fund. And the output of that DAG ends up triggering the add 979 DAG for each instance that has bookplate data to be added. One of the technical challenges of this implementation was converging on the data models that are passed in the XCOM, which are cross communications between tasks in Airflow, and also the data passed between the DAGs. The instances paid on bookplate funds DAG has some branching in it. When the fetch bookplate metadata DAG triggers this particular DAG with new bookplate data, it follows the path to query all invoice lines paid on that fund. So, yes. When it's running its weekly schedule, it takes the date range of its last run and current run and uses that to query invoices paid in that date range. And then it checks if invoice lines use a bookplate fund, gets the linked PO lines from the fund distributions and the invoice lines, and from the PO lines gets the instance UUIDs linked to them. And then finally, the output, I did this again. The output of this DAG is the same data model that the UI outputs to trigger the add 979 DAG. And that data model is just an instance UUID with a list of bookplate data. Another technical challenge we encountered was our query to Folio for the invoice lines paid on a bookplate fund. Some bookplate funds had a number of paid invoice lines greater than 1,000. In our Airflow DAG, we used what's called dynamic task mapping for some tasks, so that if a step needs to be rerun, we can rerun that task for that specific piece of data and not have to loop through an entire list of, say, invoice IDs to get the corresponding invoice lines. In our version of Airflow, the default limit of map tasks is set to 1,000. If we have more tasks than that, we get a runtime error. However, increasing the number of map tasks can also impact Airflow's performance. So, when we look up invoice lines paid on a bookplate fund, that data returned from the query is passed to the next step in the workflow, which expands the list of invoice lines into a map task. Each invoice line is used in this task to look up bookplate metadata in our database table and create a data structure that correlates the PO line ID from the invoice line with the bookplate data. Since some bookplate funds had a number of paid invoice lines greater than 1,000, we ended up passing along a list of lists to map to tasks in these cases. This is what this UI looks like for staff to upload a CSV of instance UUIDs to which corresponding MARC record they want to add 979 tags. They select a bookplate fund, upload their file, and hit submit. When 979s are added, a summary email is sent that shows the instance UUID, the bookplate data, and whether or not the DAG run succeeded or failed. Sometimes this DAG fails to add 979s because not everything has a MARC record when paid. We failed the task to add 979, which fails the DAG run when there is no MARC in SRS for the instance that was paid on a bookplate fund. Not to worry though, staff don't need to keep track of what failed to get a 979. We have a DAG to do that. The retry failed 979 DAG. It queries Airflow for failed DAG runs and reruns them to try again. This is done on a monthly schedule. Eventually, a MARC record gets added and the DAG run will succeed as the catalogers work through their backlog. So when I tech led this work cycle, I thought I knew everything that needed to be done because I worked on the previous implementation before Folio. And from that perspective of doing exactly what was done before, I did. We implemented digital book plates to do what it did before. But Folio has a data model for package PO lines. We caught this after the work cycle and fixed it later. Meanwhile, the UI to add 979 tags was an acceptable substitution. Thank you. Any questions? We saved a lot of time for questions.
I'll pass the mic around. Any questions in the room or online?
There's,
Can you hear out of this microphone, Shelley?
yes, I can.
Everything's worked in here so far.
Yay.
Jinx it. Todd?
Hello, Todd Olson, University of Chicago. Could you talk a little bit about how the UI for the user interacts with Airflow, how that connection is made?
Um, I'm guessing you're asking specifically the UI that the staff use or the,
Yes.
okay. It's Flask is like an easy like a web template plugin that you can add to your Airflow project, and um, I don't know how else to explain it. Let me go back to a slide.
Todd's gonna elaborate. Hold on one second, Shelley.
Okay.
So then does the like when the person uses the UI and hits enter to add the I don't know, to add a piece of data, does that act of hitting enter directly trigger the trigger a DAG to launch, or is that and this could be for any of these interfaces where you have a staff interface for Airflow. Does it put it into some processing queue where a DAG looks periodically to see whether there's work to do? I mean, how's that triggering work, like from getting the data from the user's key, fingers into the processing stream?
Yeah. So in Airflow, you could actually do whatever you want, right? You can program it so that it does, when a user hits submits, it does trigger a specific DAG. It's called a trigger DAG operator in Airflow. And so for the UI for adding a 979 tag, that is programmed, that's coded so that it triggers that DAG. Um, the other ones as well for data exports. Yes, another way you can do in Airflow, like um, have what's called, I think maybe it's called a sensor in Airflow, where it constantly pulls something to see whether it should run something. So you could do, it's pretty flexible. You could do whatever you want.
Thanks, Shelley. Well, we have another question in the room.
Hi, Shelley. It's Maccabee Levine, Lehigh. A couple of questions. First, I'm just curious. I know there are a couple of different workflow engines in use among the Folio community. I know I see Kevin from A&M shaking his head because they use Camunda down there. I think there's another one maybe at Cornell. I'm just wondering, were either of you part of the Airflow selection, process, and what some of the pros and cons might have been there over some of the other workflow possibilities?
Um, we had departmental experience with Airflow for other projects in the like on the digital library side of the house here. And I don't know, it was just kind of like, let's just go with Airflow. I think Jeremy Nelson might be a good one to ask since he's the one who brought it over to library systems for us.
I will do that. Then
Yeah,
related,
throw him under the bus.
absolutely. So then related to that, I know at Lehigh we definitely have some technology products that are like a hammer for us, where everything is a nail, and we try to use that same platform for everything, sometimes to our detriment. I definitely see the advantage of treating all these disparate processes using workflows with DAGs and Airflow. I'm wondering if when you evaluate each new thing, do you sort of say, should this be a workflow in Airflow, right? Or in other words, is it a good hammer, or is it a hammer that you just use because you already have the hammer? right? And where that
Yeah.
lies.
I'd add to what I said. We also had this thing called Libsys Web Forms before. It was a Ruby on Rails web thing that we did for handling some of this stuff in like integrations with and automating workflows with our old ILS. And it doesn't, you could integrate some like scheduling stuff in it if you use Sidekick, I think it's called in Rails. It's kind of like this background jobs thing. But for me, for some of the stuff that we've automated, I really like. I don't know. I really pushed for Airflow. I'm familiar with it now after working with it. It's we can I like the scheduling aspect of it, or not. I don't want to say scheduling aspect, but how Airflow you could queue up tasks, you could schedule stuff, and just its whole like job, how it prioritizes and schedules jobs and stuff. I don't know. And also for another project that I've been working on, the Folio data anonymization project, we kind of like went with Airflow and experimented with deploying the Bitnami Airflow image and Bitnami Helm chart to Kubernetes so that we can do really neat things where each task that Airflow spins up and does a process for spins up a new pod in the cluster. And so you could like, I feel like I'm not explaining this correctly, but you can do really neat things with allocating and having more control over resourcing for the Airflow. Like right now, we deploy it as a Docker container to, I think, like a Linux or Ubuntu server, and we don't really have much control about the number of resources that container is getting. We're not spinning up multiple Docker containers running the different like Airflow web, Airflow scheduler, and Airflow task containers. And yeah, I don't know. You could just do some really cool stuff with Airflow.
Thank you.
Shelly, since you can't see the room, I'll let you know that our entire team is here. So if you want to pick on them. Are there any other questions?
Okay, we got
One
a
more.
question
Oh, go ahead, Shelly, and then I'll go back to the room.
Okay, are you considering automating more processes with Airflow? If so, how are you working with stakeholders to identify and prioritize opportunities?
I can
Answer maybe.
start with that, Shelly. Can you hear me still?
Yep.
Yes, there's definitely things coming down the pipe that we want to automate. How are we working with stakeholders to prioritize those? Was that the second part of the question?
Stakeholders to identify and prioritize opportunities.
We have a Folio steering committee at Stanford that works at like a higher level to identify priorities and help us figure out what we need to do next. Beyond that, oh, my boss is raising her hand. So 1 second.
Yeah, I can maybe. When we first started implementing Folio, one of the big things that we wanted to do was materials tracking. As new books came in and were received and then went through cataloging and processing and then out to the branches. And everything we ended up doing revolves around doing a check-in at the different desks. And having a bulk edit, but a bulk check-in is high on the list of things that our users ask for. So we think maybe we can try to do that. If we can ever get past Eureka, we will have time to code some of these new things. And then another one that we think is a good candidate would be like doing reserves processing, all the different steps, like separate steps that staff have to do to put something on reserve. We're looking at that as well. If anybody's interested in that, I don't know, maybe some talk in the community might be nice for that. I know there's a workflow application that TAMU has been trying to get going. Also, Eureka also puts up a big speed bump on that. So, but I know they have designed it so that you can use mod Airflow, like make a mod Airflow to use as your workflow manager with that. So, as well as they're using Camunda. Is that right? Is that how you say it? So we interview people. We get requests all the time for, can you help us do this, please, better? Even though that wasn't very good English. So, right, interviewing staff, and as Alyssa said, the steering committee.
I'm going to go to the question in the room, Shelley.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing kind of what your users are asking for, because I think that's ripe for cross collaboration. But I was going to ask about kind of the digital plates and also like how users kind of get to view this and interact with it. And you mentioned not wanting to use MARC fields and not want to use your 9XX. And so what would be the ideal solution for that metadata, for that information in your discovery?
When we were evaluating this, I was thinking, well, maybe something in the instance record, like maybe we could stuff it in I'm item status, no, not an item, an instance category or something. I can't remember, one of those that end up getting indexed by Folio in the inventory app so that users could facet on it if they wanted to, like staff users. Because, putting it in the 979 field, I guess if acquisitions wanted to run reports on figuring out if all the records should have 979 fields have them, they can't do that really in Folio. I mean, I guess there's now mod FQM manager and stuff, but you can't. There's like there's a higher bar for querying MARC fields in Folio. Or they have to wait until the data makes it to MetaDB and run. We have MetaDB, so they could run queries there, and yeah. So I would say something that's not in the MARC data. I don't know if Alyssa or anybody else has.
I'll just add that as it stands with it in the MARC data, the users are interacting with it through our discovery layer. So you can go there and facet and see the actual display. So our discovery layer pulls that MARC data and uses it to display the actual bookplate. I think it is indexed, right, Shelley? In SearchWorks? Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Are there any other online questions, Shelley?
Nope.
One more in the room.
Yeah, I was wondering, going back to your first example around vendor management applications, and you were talking about data loading for e-resources and changing some policies, and you had mentioned that you were using a single record approach, and then you were also wanting to get the URLs into the holdings record. I'm wondering, like, what have you ended up with now if you're still doing single record approach? And it sounded like you're still keeping things maybe at the instance level, and where you might want to go with that.
Right now I'll start with where we put the URLs. We do not put the URLs in our holdings records. We abandoned that idea at the time, and I don't think it's really being discussed anymore. I'd have to check with metadata colleagues on that. For the single record approach, we did abandon that at the time, or at least decide that we were going to make an effort to move away from it. Of course, we still had a ton of data that was in this merged state, but that decision during that work cycle prompted a policy change that had been kind of floating around for a long time. And so we made the policy change officially. And then in the meantime, since we migrated, our metadata folks have been working to kind of undo it where we can, not do it anymore. As we load more records, we don't merge anything anymore. But we know we're always going to be in this mixed state, kind of. Well, for a long time, we'll be in this mixed state. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.